He did not know yet that he had just signed his name to the one woman in London who could destroy him with a single letter, and that she had no intention of doing it quickly. The ink was still wet on the page when the Duke of Ravensford handed it back to his solicitor, his jaw set with the particular pride of a man who believes he has outwitted his own ruin. Across the city, in a quiet study lined with maritime charts and ledgers, no man had ever thought to question. A woman in unfashionable gray read the very same document, and smiled the kind of smile that promised nothing good and everything patient. He thought he had borrowed from a faceless trading house. He had borrowed from her. And before the season was out, he would learn that some debts are paid not in coin, but in humility. The ballroom at Lady Caro's townhouse glittered with the particular brightness, reserved for those who had never once worried where their next quarter's income would come from crystal, candlelight, and the easy laughter of men who had inherited their certainty along with their titles. Margaret Ashworth stood near the edge of it all, neither hiding nor seeking attention, dressed in the soft gray of a morning not yet ended. 8 months had passed since her father's death, and society had already grown impatient with her grief, as though sorrow, like a gown, ought to go out of fashion on schedule. She had not come to dance. She had come because her solicitor, Mr. Finch, insisted that a woman managing an empire of ships and warehouses could not afford to disappear entirely from view, even if every soul in this glittering room believed her irrelevant to anything that mattered. It was a small mistake, then, to speak. A cluster of gentlemen had been discussing loudly, as gentlemen do when they wish to be overheard, the rising cost of marine insurance and the foolishness of certain merchant houses gambling on Atlantic crossings during storm season. Margaret, who had spent the better part of a decade at her father's side learning exactly which captains could be trusted with a ship worth more than most men's estates, offered a quiet correction. A simple one, a true one. The laughter that followed did not come from the men she'd corrected. It came from the Duke of Ravensford. He had not even been part of the conversation, merely passing, golden and careless in the way only men who had never been hungry could afford to be careless. And he turned, delighted, as though she had performed a trick for his amusement. "Forgive me," he said, to the room rather than to her, "but I confess I find it rather charming, a lady speaking of cargo holds and tariffs as though she has ever set foot near a dock in her life." The room laughed with him. It always did. Margaret did not flush. She did not stammer or retreat as he so plainly expected. She simply looked at him, a long, level look, the kind a woman gives a ledger she already knows does not balance, and said nothing at all. It was the silence, more than any words could have managed, that made something flicker uneasily behind his amusement. A flicker he would not understand the meaning of for several weeks yet. She excused herself shortly after, gathering her shawl with unhurried grace, and asked a footman to call for her carriage. It arrived within minutes, a fine, well-sprung carriage, far too fine for a woman in last season's gray, bearing on its door a crest the Duke did not recognize. He would have cause to recognize it soon enough. 3 days before the ball, the Duke of Ravensford had sat in this same study he now paced, listening to his man of business deliver news with the careful, bloodless tone of a physician describing a wound that would not heal cleanly. "The harvest income will not cover the spring obligations, Your Grace, not even close." Nathaniel Hale, Duke of Ravensford, had inherited a great many things from his father. A title older than most of the surrounding county, a house that required 40 servants to keep from collapsing into ruin, and a debt so deeply buried beneath decades of pride that he had not discovered its full weight until the old man was already 6 months in the ground. His father had borrowed against everything, land, timber rights, even the silver eventually, And when the traditional lenders had grown wary of the Ravensford name, his father had turned quietly, shamefully, to merchant trade houses. Faceless institutions that asked fewer questions and demanded only that the interest be paid, the cargo insured, the ships kept moving. Nathaniel had continued the arrangement out of necessity rather than choice. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself that once the new shipping contracts matured, once the estate's other ventures bore fruit, he would settle every note and never again have to sign his name to a stranger's ledger. "And the loan renewal?" he asked. "The one due next month, Ashworth and Sons." His man of business did not look up from his papers. "The same terms as before, Your Grace. Fair, if I may say so. Firmer than most, but fair. Mr. Finch handles the correspondence personally." Finch? Nathaniel turned the name over, indifferent. "And who is Ashworth * precisely? I've never met the man." "I believe the founder is deceased, Your Grace. The company continues under new management." Nathaniel did not ask further. Why would he? It was simply a name on a page, the sort of faceless commercial entity that kept his ships moving and his roof from caving in, no different to him than the name on a coal merchant's invoice. He had never once paused to wonder whose hand actually signed the approvals, whose mind calculated the risk on his behalf, whose patience alone kept his estate from collapsing into public ruin. He had laughed at a woman in gray 3 nights ago for daring to speak of cargo holds and tariffs. He had no notion, yet, that the woman who held his entire fortune in her hands had been standing not 10 feet away from him at the time, and that she understood his finances rather better than he understood them himself. The study at the Ashworth townhouse held none of the gilded excess of Lady Caro's ballroom. Instead, its walls were lined with charts of shipping lanes, leather-bound account books, and a single portrait of a man with kind, tired eyes, her father, painted the year before his health began its slow decline. Margaret sat at his old desk most evenings now, the desk too large for her frame, but exactly the right size for the work it demanded. Tonight, the ledger open before her bore a name that had occupied rather more of her attention than she cared to admit. Ravensford, renewal due 30 days. Her father had been a remarkable man, but not, society would have insisted, a respectable one, not in the way that mattered to drawing rooms and patronesses. He had built his fortune from nothing, from cargo holds and storms survived and contracts won through sheer stubborn cleverness, and society had spent decades reminding him of it whenever the opportunity arose. He had also been a man who understood, long before his daughter did, that a woman's mind could hold a ledger as steady as any man's, steadier, often, given how rarely anyone thought to question her. So when he had drawn up his will, knowing the illness in his chest would not relent, he had not left his empire to a distant nephew or a trusted partner, as everyone expected. He had left it entirely to Margaret, full ownership, full authority, with one quiet provision. Mr. Finch, his most loyal solicitor, would serve as the public face of Ashworth and Sons. Letters would bear his signature. Meetings, when unavoidable, would be conducted in his name. Margaret would remain the hand behind the curtain. It was not vanity that kept her there. It was simple arithmetic. A woman who controlled half the shipping credit in London would find doors closing rather than opening, suitors evaporating, rivals circling. Better, her father had always said, to be underestimated and powerful than admired and powerless. She had managed Ravensford's account for over a year now under this arrangement, extending the renewal twice, adjusting terms when his harvest income faltered, watching from behind Mr. Finch's careful letters as the young Duke's estate teetered closer to the edge without ever quite falling. She had told herself it was simply good business, fair terms properly secured, nothing personal. And then she had seen him at the ball. She had recognized him instantly, the line of his jaw, the careless golden ease of him, utterly unchanged from a summer nearly 9 years past, when she had been a girl of 17 and her father had been newly, painfully wealthy, and the Ravensford family had made certain that all of society understood exactly how little that wealth was worth without a name to match it. She remembered a garden party. She remembered her mother's face, brittle with humiliation, after the old Duke, Nathaniel's father, had made a joke at her father's expense that the entire party had repeated for weeks. She remembered Nathaniel himself, younger then, laughing along with his father's cruelty without a flicker of conscience, because it had cost him nothing to laugh. He likely did not remember it at all. She remembered every word. So when he had turned to her at the ball, careless, golden, utterly unaware, and mocked her for daring to understand the very trade that now held his entire estate afloat, something old and long buried had settled, quiet and cold, into place. She closed the ledger gently. "Mr. Finch," she said to the empty room, though he was not yet there to hear it, "I believe I should like to attend the renewal meeting myself this time." It was not revenge she wanted, not precisely. She was not yet certain what she wanted. But she intended, at last, to let the Duke of Ravensford look her in the eye. The morning of the renewal meeting arrived gray and close, the kind of London sky that pressed down on the rooftops like a held breath. Nathaniel Hale dressed with more care than the occasion strictly warranted, a fact his valet noted but was wise enough not to mention, because a man facing the possibility of losing two of his finest ships preferred, at the very least, to lose them looking like a duke rather than a debtor. The offices of Ashworth and Sons occupied a narrow but handsome building near the docks, close enough to smell the tar and salt on the air, far enough from the fashionable streets that most of the ton would never think to set foot there. Nathaniel had visited twice before, both times briefly, both times greeted by the unfailingly polite and unfailingly evasive Mr. Finch, who answered every probing question about the company's true ownership with the practiced vagueness of a man paid handsomely to be vague. Today, Mr. Finch was waiting in the entrance hall, looking, Nathaniel thought, with the first flicker of unease, rather more nervous than the occasion warranted. "Your Grace," Finch's bow was correct, but his eyes kept sliding toward the closed door of the inner office. "If you would not object, we have an advisor joining us today, a matter of some complexity in the renewal terms." "An advisor?" Nathaniel raised a brow. "I was under the impression I was dealing directly with the principal parties, Finch." "You are, Your Grace, quite directly." Something in Finch's voice suggested the statement carried more weight than its words alone could bear, but Nathaniel, distracted by the looming weight of his own circumstances, did not press further. The inner office was plainer than he expected, no gilt, no ostentation, simply good furniture chosen for its usefulness rather than its display. Charts of shipping lanes covered one wall. A large window overlooked the masts of ships swaying gently at anchor. And seated at the long table, with the unhurried composure of a woman entirely at home in a room most ladies would never be permitted to enter, was Margaret Ashworth. Nathaniel stopped just inside the doorway. He recognized the gray gown before he recognized her face, recognized it, in fact, with a small jolt of irritation, as though encountering an unpleasant smell he'd hoped to have left behind at Lady Caro's ballroom. The woman from the ball, the one who had dared lecture a room full of gentlemen on shipping insurance as though she'd ever held a captain's log in her life. "Your Grace," Margaret rose, inclining her head with perfect, unbothered courtesy. "Please sit, we have a great deal to discuss." "Forgive me." Nathaniel did not sit. "I was given to understand this was a meeting regarding the terms of my loan renewal, a matter, I think, requiring rather more discretion than—" He paused, searching for a word that would not sound as ungracious as the one in his mind. "Than an audience." "I am not an audience, Your Grace." Margaret's voice remained level, pleasant even, though something flickered behind her eyes, the same flicker he'd seen at the ball and dismissed without a second thought. I am an advisor to this firm, with a thorough understanding of your account. If you would prefer to proceed without my input, I am sure Mr. Finch can attempt to manage the renewal terms alone, though I confess I would not recommend it, given the complications. Complications. Nathaniel finally sat, more from the desire to end the conversation than any genuine willingness to include her in it. What complications? The terms were agreed upon last year, a simple renewal at the same rate. Terms were agreed upon last year, Margaret said, when your spring shipment of timber cleared customs without incident, and before the Asterisk Sparrow lost 3 weeks at anchor in Lisbon awaiting repairs, you have not yet paid for in full. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Your harvest income this year falls short of last year's by some considerable margin, Your Grace, a fact your own steward confirmed to Mr. Finch in correspondence dated the 14th of last month. Renewing at the same rate, given the firm's exposure, would not be sound business. I assume you do not wish this firm to extend you credit it cannot reasonably expect repaid. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. You seem remarkably well informed for an asterisk advisor asterisk, madam. I am paid to be well informed. A faint, humorless smile touched her mouth. It is, I find, rather more useful than being merely decorative. The barb landed precisely where she intended it to. Nathaniel felt the heat climb his collar, not merely irritation now, but something closer to genuine discomfort, the particular discomfort of a man accustomed to being the most informed person in any room suddenly finding himself outmatched by someone he had dismissed without a second thought 3 nights prior. He pressed forward anyway, because pride more than strategy was steering him now. Then perhaps you can explain to me, with all your information, why a firm of trade should presume to dictate terms to a peer of the realm, rather than simply extend the courtesy it has extended for the past several years. Because courtesy, Margaret said quietly, is not collateral, Your Grace, and a title, however old, does not repay a debt. The silence that followed was the kind that rings. Mr. Finch, watching from the corner of the room with the expression of a man observing a duel he had not been consulted about, cleared his throat and attempted, gently, to steer them back toward the actual figures. The adjusted interest, the revised repayment schedule, the additional security required against the 2 ships still owed against. Nathaniel answered the questions put to him, but distractedly, his attention caught again and again by the woman across the table, who asked precise, devastating questions about his estate's income that he found himself, humiliatingly, unable to answer with any real confidence. How many tenant farms remain under lease renewal this year? He did not know precisely. What percentage of last year's coal revenue was reinvested rather than collected? He had to admit he was not certain. And does Your Grace's steward anticipate the new contracts with the Indies Trading Company will offset the loss from the Lisbon delay, or merely slow it? He had no answer at all. Each question was delivered without malice, without triumph, simply asked, the way one might ask after the weather, and yet each one landed like a small, precise blow, stripping away, piece by piece, the easy confidence he had walked in with. By the time the meeting concluded, the renewal terms had been set fair, as his man of business had promised, but firmer, with tighter security and a shorter grace period than before, and Nathaniel rose from the table feeling, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, thoroughly and comprehensively outmaneuvered. Thank you for your time, Your Grace. Margaret remained seated as he gathered himself to leave, her composure unbroken. Mr. Finch will send the finalized papers within the week. Nathaniel paused at the door, some old, wounded vanity insisting on the last word. You are remarkably forthright, madam, for a woman whose name I do not even know. Something passed behind her eyes then, quick, sharp, gone before he could properly read it. No, she agreed softly, I don't suppose you do. He left without an answer, telling himself the unease settling in his chest was simply the ordinary discomfort of a man who had nearly lost 2 ships and narrowly kept them. It would be some weeks yet before he understood that the unease had another name entirely, and that he had been standing in the same room as it for the better part of an hour. The unease Nathaniel had carried out of that office did not fade with the passing days, as he had expected it would. Instead, it settled into him the way damp settles into old stone, quietly, persistently, finding every crack his pride had left unguarded. He found himself, in idle moments, returning to the woman's questions about his estate, questions he had been unable to answer and had since spent considerable effort answering for himself, to his own growing alarm. His steward, when pressed, confirmed every uncomfortable figure she had cited. The tenant leases were indeed unsettled. The coal revenue had indeed been squandered on repairs that ought to have waited. The new contracts with the Indies Trading Company would, at best, merely slow his decline rather than reverse it. He had been managed, he realized, not merely lent to, but managed asterisk, by a faceless trading house that apparently understood his own estate's failings better than he did. It was this realization, more than any social obligation, that sent him back to the offices near the docks not 3 weeks later, ostensibly to discuss a minor adjustment to the shipping insurance on the renewed loan, but in truth because he could no longer bear the not knowing. He wanted to understand who, precisely, had been watching his estate crumble from behind Mr. Finch's careful letters, and why a woman with no evident connection to trade had been sitting in that office speaking of his finances with more authority than his own man of business. Mr. Finch met him at the door with the same nervous correctness as before, but this time, when Nathaniel asked bluntly, without patience for further evasion, to speak with whoever truly owned the firm, Finch's composure finally, visibly, cracked. "Your Grace, I must insist that the structure of this firm's ownership is a private matter, not. I have signed 3 years of notes to this firm, Finch, and I have never once been permitted to know whose pocket my interest payments fill. I am beginning to suspect," Nathaniel said, with the particular coldness of a proud man who has begun, belatedly, to feel the ground shift beneath him, "that there is a rival house behind this. Some competitor enjoying a private joke at my expense by lending to me through an intermediary. I will know who it is, Finch, or I will take my business and my notes elsewhere, whatever the cost to me." It was not, strictly, an empty threat, and Finch, who understood better than anyone the delicate position the firm's success depended upon, hesitated only a moment longer before excusing himself to consult the principal. He returned with Margaret. She wore gray again. Nathaniel would come to understand, much later, that she had worn very little else since her father's death, a fact he had been too consumed with his own circumstances to notice the significance of, and she carried with her the same unhurried composure that had so unsettled him weeks before, though something in her expression now suggested she had made a decision she was not entirely at peace with. "Your Grace requested to know the ownership of this firm," she said, without preamble, closing the door behind her. "I had hoped to delay this conversation rather longer, but I find I have run out of convenient delays." "You," Nathaniel stared at her, the pieces arranging themselves with slow, dawning horror. "You are not merely an asterisk advisor asterisk." "No." Margaret moved to stand behind the desk, her father's desk, though Nathaniel had no way of knowing that yet, and folded her hands before her with the calm of a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times in the privacy of her own mind and found no version of it painless. "My name is Margaret Ashworth. My father founded this firm. Upon his death, I inherited it in full, every ship, every contract, every note of credit it has ever extended, including yours, Your Grace. Including all 3 years of them." The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular silence of a man hearing the floor of his own certainty give way beneath him. "Then every renewal," he said slowly, Every term, every question you asked me in this very room were mine to ask, yes. I have managed your account personally for over a year. Her voice did not waver, though something in it had gone very careful, very controlled, the control, he would later understand, of a woman determined not to let triumph show, because triumph was not, in truth, what she felt. I extended your renewal twice when your harvest income faltered. I adjusted your terms when the asterisk sparrow sat idle in Lisbon. Every kindness this firm has shown your estate these past 3 years, your grace, has been mine to grant or to withhold. Nathaniel sat down without being invited to, the strength having gone rather suddenly out of his legs. Why, he managed at last, would you grant kindness to a man who, he stopped himself, but the memory arrived anyway, unbidden and humiliating. The ballroom, the laughter, his own voice declaring, a lady speaking of cargo holds and tariffs as though she has ever set foot near a dock. Who mocked me at a ball 3 weeks before I sat across a table and corrected every error in his estate's accounting. Margaret finished for him, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, though gentleness was clearly not the whole of what she felt. Yes, I have asked myself the same question more than once. Then why? The word came out rougher than he intended. Why extend me anything at all if you had cause to wish me ill? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting briefly to the portrait on the wall, her father, kind-eyed and tired, watching over a conversation he had not lived to see. Because it was sound business, your grace, and my father raised me never to let personal feeling interfere with sound business. She paused. And because, for a long time, I told myself that was the whole of it, that I felt nothing toward you beyond the ordinary indifference one feels toward any debtor. Her eyes returned to his, and now there was something harder in them, something old. It was not entirely true. Explain. You do not remember me, she said. It was not a question. 9 years ago, a garden party at Lord Pemberton's estate. My father had just secured a contract that made him, briefly, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, wealthier, certainly, than half the titled families in attendance, including your own. He was proud of it. He had earned every shilling through storms survived and risks no titled gentleman would have dared take. Her voice did not rise, but it sharpened, each word placed with the precision of a woman who had carried this memory carefully, for a very long time, exactly as it happened. Your father made a joke at his expense that afternoon about the smell of fish clinging to new money, no matter how thoroughly it was perfumed. The whole party laughed. My mother did not speak for the rest of the day. And you, she looked at him directly now, you laughed loudest of anyone, your grace. You were perhaps 19. I was 17. I have not forgotten it, though I rather think you have. Nathaniel said nothing. He could not, in honesty, recall the moment she described, could not summon his father's joke, the laughter, any of it, and the not remembering felt, suddenly, like its own particular shame, a confirmation of exactly how little the cruelty had cost him at the time, and how much it had evidently cost her. I did not engineer your debt to me as revenge, Margaret continued, quieter now. I want that understood. Your father's mismanagement and your own inattention did that quite thoroughly without my assistance. But when you stood in that ballroom 3 weeks ago and mocked me for daring to understand trade, the very trade that has, for over a year, been the only thing standing between your estate and ruin, something in me that I had thought long settled was no longer willing to stay quiet. So you sat across from me, Nathaniel said slowly, and let me humiliate myself with questions I could not answer, knowing precisely who you were and precisely what I had once said to you. I let you see, your grace, exactly how little you actually understood about the estate you were so certain you commanded. There was no apology in her voice. I did not lie to you. I did not cheat you. Every figure I gave you was accurate, every term fair. I simply allowed you, for the first time in your life, to sit across from a woman you considered beneath your notice and discover she understood your own affairs better than you did. Nathaniel rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, his composure fraying at the edges in a way it rarely did before strangers. But she was no longer, he understood with a lurch, entirely a stranger. "And what do you intend to do with this knowledge of me, this debt, this history between our families?" His voice had lost its earlier hauteur entirely. What remained was something closer to genuine fear, carefully concealed. "Ruin me, as your family was once made to feel ruined. Call in every note at once and watch the estate fall and call it justice." Margaret studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since he had entered the room, something almost like weariness crossed her features. "If I wish to ruin you, Your Grace," she said quietly, "I assure you, I have had ample opportunity these past 3 years and considerably more cause as of 3 weeks ago. I have not done so. I do not know yet whether that is wisdom or simply weakness on my part. But I will tell you this plainly. Your debt is not going anywhere, and neither, I think, is the truth of who holds it. What you choose to do with that knowledge, Your Grace, that is rather more your concern than mine." She did not offer him comfort. She did not offer him forgiveness. She simply held the door open, with the same unhurried composure she had carried into the room, and waited for him to find his own way out of it. He left her offices that afternoon a thoroughly altered man, stripped not merely of his certainty regarding his finances, but of something rather more fundamental: the easy, unexamined assumption that the world's regard for him had ever been entirely earned. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel Hale did the one thing his pride had never permitted him to do in the whole of his adult life. He tried, methodically and with mounting desperation, to find another way out. He called first upon Lord Brackenridge, an old family friend of his father's whose fortune in coal and railway speculation had made him, in recent years, something of an unofficial banker to half the impoverished nobility north of London. Brackenridge received him warmly enough, listened to his proposal with every appearance of sympathy, and then, with evident regret, declined. "I should be glad to help you, Ravensford, truly I would, but I find my own credit rather tightly extended this season. Perhaps in the autumn." It was, Nathaniel suspected even as he heard it, a polite fiction, though he could not yet say why. He tried next a merchant bank in the city, recommended by his solicitor as discreet and well-funded. The clerk who received him was courteous, even deferential, until the matter of existing obligations arose, at which point the man's manner cooled with a swiftness that suggested he already knew, somehow, precisely what those obligations were, and to whom they were owed. "We should need rather more time to consider an arrangement of this complexity, Your Grace. Perhaps if you returned in a month or 2. By the fourth such refusal, delivered with the same vague courtesy and the same swift cooling once his existing debts were mentioned, Nathaniel began to understand, with a creeping and humiliating clarity, exactly what he was up against. Margaret Ashworth had not built her father's fortune merely through luck or inheritance. She had built it and maintained it through a thorough and exacting understanding of every other house of credit operating in London, who they trusted, who they avoided, whose name carried weight in a quiet conversation between men who had no reason to ever mention her own. He did not know, and would likely never know with certainty, whether she had spoken a single word to any of them regarding his circumstances. It hardly mattered. Her reputation alone, patient, exacting, never extending credit she did not expect repaid, had apparently taught every other lender in the city to look rather more carefully at any risk she had not already absorbed herself. He was, in short, cornered, not through malice, so far as he could determine, but through the simple, devastating logic of a market that trusted her judgment more than it trusted his name. It took him another fortnight to swallow what remained of his pride and return to the offices near the docks. This time he did not bring his solicitor, nor any of the careful formality that had armored his previous visits. He arrived alone, on foot rather than by carriage, having walked the better part of the distance in an effort to settle the unruly state of his own thoughts, and asked simply to see her. Margaret received him in the same plain office, though this time she rose when he entered, a small courtesy, but one he noted and was grateful for, more than he expected to be. "Your Grace." She studied him for a moment, taking in, he suspected, rather more than his appearance alone suggested, the absence of his carriage, the slight disorder of a man who had walked further than his boots were suited for, the particular set of his shoulders that spoke of a man arriving not to negotiate, but to confess. "I had wondered when you would come." "You knew, then, about Brackenridge, the bank in the city?" "I knew you would try them," she said, without apology. "I did not need to do anything to ensure they would decline you, Your Grace, if that is what you have come to accuse me of. My reputation does that work without my assistance. Lenders who deal honestly do not generally relish lending into a risk I have already declined to absorb myself. They assume, not unreasonably, that I would know better than they. Then I have no recourse left to me." He said it plainly, without the bitterness he might once have brought to such an admission. "I have come to ask not to negotiate, not to dispute your terms, which have been fairer to me than I deserved, but simply to ask you outright. What is it you want from me, Margaret Ashworth? You could have ruined me a dozen times over by now and have chosen not to. You could have let every door in London close on me without ever lifting a finger, and instead you have extended me terms no lender in his right mind would offer a man in my position. I no longer believe that is merely sound business. I should like, if you are willing to tell me, to understand why." Something shifted in her expression at the use of her full name, a flicker he could not entirely interpret, though he thought, perhaps, it was the first time he had spoken to her, as though she were a person rather than a problem to be managed or a debt to be settled. "Sit, Your Grace," she said, more gently than she had spoken to him in any of their previous meetings. "This will take rather longer than either of us is accustomed to standing for." He sat. She did not sit immediately, choosing instead to stand near the window overlooking the masts swaying gently at anchor, her back to him for a long moment before she spoke. "My father," she began, "built this firm from nothing, Your Grace. He was the son of a dockworker who taught himself to read by candlelight after 12-hour days hauling cargo he did not yet own a single share of. He spent 30 years earning a fortune that men born to titles considered, even at the height of his success, somehow lesser than their own, not because his money was worth less, but because it had been earned rather than inherited, and society has never quite forgiven a man for proving that distinction does not matter nearly so much as it pretends to." "I am aware," Nathaniel said quietly, "that my own family was among those who made that distinction felt rather more sharply than was kind." "You are aware of it now," Margaret said, turning to face him at last, "because I told you. You were not aware of it 9 years ago when it happened, because it cost you nothing to laugh and even less to forget. That is, I think, the cruelty of it that has stayed with me rather longer than the insult itself. Not that your father humiliated mine, though God knows that was painful enough to witness. It was that none of you ever had to remember it afterward. My mother remembered it for the rest of her life. I have remembered it for 9 years, and you did not even recall it existed until I described it to you in this very room 3 weeks ago." Nathaniel absorbed this in silence, the truth of it settling into him with the particular discomfort of a man recognizing, for the first time, the precise weight of carelessness he had never before considered a cruelty at all. "I will not pretend to you," he said finally, "that I can undo 9 years of not remembering. I cannot give you back whatever that afternoon cost your mother or your father or you. I am not entirely certain such things can be given back at all once taken. But I am asking you to believe that I am sorry for it, not merely for the ballroom, 3 weeks past, though I am sorry for that as well, more sorry than I think you yet credit me capable of being, but for the whole of it. For every careless thing my family ever did to yours, And for every year I spent never once wondering whether the ease of my own life came at some cost, I had simply never bothered to notice. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression he could not entirely read, something between caution and a tentative, unfamiliar softening. "That is, I think, the first wholly honest thing you have said to me, Your Grace," she said at last. "I find," Nathaniel admitted, with a rueful, unfamiliar humility, "that honesty becomes rather easier once a man has run out of every other resource available to him." A faint, unwilling smile touched the corner of her mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but he had seen it, and something in his chest loosened slightly at the sight of it. "My father always said," she said, "that the measure of a man was not whether he was born with advantages, but what he did once he discovered he had taken them for granted." She returned to her desk, though she did not immediately sit, resting her hands instead against its worn wooden surface. "I do not know yet, Your Grace, whether you are a man capable of genuine change, or merely a man currently desperate enough to perform it convincingly. I have been deceived by convincing performances before." "Then test me," Nathaniel said, with more directness than he had intended. "However long it takes, I have, it seems, very little else remaining to occupy my time besides proving myself to you." "That," Margaret said, something dry and almost warm threading through her voice, "may take rather longer than Your Grace anticipates." "I find," he said quietly, "that I am no longer in any particular hurry." It was, neither of them fully realized in that moment, the precise instant at which the ground between them, debt and debtor, mockery and memory, 9 years of unspoken grievance began, very slowly, to shift into something else entirely. The truth, as truths involving fortune and pride so often do, did not remain contained for long. It began, as these things generally do, with something small and seemingly insignificant. A clerk in Mr. Finch's employ, recently dismissed for carelessness with the firm's correspondence, who found himself rather more embittered by his dismissal than discreet about the knowledge he had acquired during his employment. A few careless words at a tavern frequented by the households of several prominent families. A name mentioned that should not have been mentioned. By the time the story reached the drawing rooms of Mayfair, it had acquired the particular embellishment that gossip always lends to anything true enough to be dangerous. Not merely that the Duke of Ravensford was indebted to a trade fortune, which would have been scandal enough on its own, but that the fortune in question was controlled, in its entirety, by an unmarried woman who had spent the better part of a year deceiving him as to her true position, and that the Duke, far from being merely her debtor, had been seen at her offices on more than one occasion since, alone, without the propriety of a chaperone or solicitor present. The story spread with the particular speed, reserved for scandal involving both money and impropriety in equal measure. Margaret learned of it first from Mr. Finch, who arrived at her townhouse one evening with the ashen, apologetic expression of a man bearing news he wished desperately had not been his to deliver. "It is being said in at least 4 households that I am aware of," he told her, "that you have spent the past year manipulating the Duke's finances for some scheme of revenge, and rather more cruelly, that whatever has passed between you since has been not entirely respectable." Margaret absorbed this with the particular stillness she had learned, over the years, to summon whenever the ground beneath her threatened to give way. "And the firm. Several of our smaller accounts have already inquired whether the rumors bear any truth, Miss Ashworth. I do not yet know how many will withdraw their business if the story is confirmed, but I would be lying if I told you the number was likely to be small. A woman's reputation, once questioned in this particular manner, tends to take rather more of the business down with it than her competence alone ever could." It was, Margaret understood with a cold and familiar clarity, precisely the danger her father had always warned her against. The reason he had structured the will the way he had, The reason Mr. Finch's name, not her own, had appeared on every public document for the better part of a decade. The moment society learned a woman controlled this much wealth and authority, it would not ask whether she had managed it well. It would ask, instead, what she had done to acquire such influence, and assume the worst answer was the true one. Nathaniel learned of it the following morning, from his own mother, who arrived at his townhouse before he had finished dressing, her face tight with an anxiety he had rarely seen her display even during the worst of his father's final illness. "Tell me it is not true," she said, without preamble, the moment he entered the drawing room. "Tell me you have not been engaged in some sordid arrangement with a tradesman's daughter, conducting business of an improper nature behind closed doors, while half of London speculates on precisely what manner of business it has been." "The business has been entirely proper, mother," Nathaniel said, with more weariness than heat. "Miss Ashworth holds my debt. I have gone to discuss the terms of it, as any debtor might. Alone, without your solicitor present on more than one occasion." His mother's voice rose, sharp with the particular fear of a woman who had spent her entire life understanding precisely how fragile a family standing could prove, once questioned. "Nathaniel, I do not care what business you claim it to have been. The whole of society is saying that the Duke of Ravensford has been compromised, financially and otherwise, by a woman with no proper standing to claim any influence over him at all. Do you understand what this will mean if it is not addressed? You will be the subject of every cruel joke in every drawing room this season, and her reputation, whatever remains of it, will not survive the telling at all." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, the weight of his mother's words settling over him with a clarity he had not permitted himself, until that instant, to fully examine. He understood, with sudden and uncomfortable precision, exactly what was being asked of him, though no one had yet asked it outright. He could distance himself from Margaret entirely, issue a quiet denial through his solicitor, allow the story to be reframed as nothing more than an ordinary creditor's business, conducted at arm's length and without any personal entanglement whatsoever. Society, given a sufficiently convincing denial from a duke, would likely accept it readily enough. Dukes were rarely questioned twice on matters they declared settled. His own reputation, in time, would recover entirely. Hers, denied any defender willing to risk his own standing on her behalf, would not. It would be the easiest thing in the world to do. It would also, he understood with sudden and total clarity, be precisely the same carelessness his own father had shown her family 9 years before, the same willingness to let someone else absorb the cost of a cruelty that touched him only lightly, because distancing himself would cost him nothing at all, while costing her everything. He found her 2 days later not at her offices but at her own townhouse, having sent ahead to request the visit rather than arrive unannounced, a small courtesy, but one he suspected mattered rather more to her, given the circumstances, than it might once have. She received him in the same plain, charts-lined study he had come to associate with her, though her composure, he noted immediately, had acquired a brittleness it had not carried before, the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent several sleepless nights calculating exactly how much she stood to lose. "3 of our accounts have withdrawn already," she told him without preamble, before he had even fully crossed the threshold. "Mr. Finch believes several more will follow within the week, once Lady Caro's ball this Friday gives the story its proper public airing. I imagine you have come to inform me that you intend to distance yourself from the rumors before they touch your own name any further. I do not blame you for it, Your Grace. It would be the sensible course." "Is that truly what you believe I have come to say?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps, or a wariness too long practiced to release easily. "I have learned, Your Grace, not to assume the best of men's intentions where their own reputations are concerned. It would not be the first time a man found honesty rather easier to abandon once the cost of maintaining it grew steep enough. Then let me be plain, since I find I have grown rather tired of being misunderstood by you, even when the misunderstanding is one I have given you ample cause to hold. Nathaniel crossed the room and stood before her, close enough that she could not mistake the seriousness in his expression for anything else. I am attending Lady Caro's ball on Friday. I intend to speak, publicly, of the full truth of our acquaintance, your ownership of the firm, the year you spent managing my estate's survival with more skill than I ever showed it myself, and my own conduct toward you, both the cruelty of it 9 years past and the gratitude I owe you now. I do not intend to let society decide for itself what manner of woman you are, when I know precisely what manner of woman you have proven yourself to be. Margaret stared at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes, hope, fear, and a wariness that could not quite believe what it was hearing. Your Grace, you do not fully understand what you are proposing. If you defend me publicly, you risk your own standing as much as mine. Society will not merely whisper about you, as it has whispered about me. It will question your judgment, your suitability, perhaps even your sanity, for associating yourself so openly with a woman of considerably more competence and character than half the peerage I have spent my life among, Nathaniel finished, with the faintest, wry edge of humor breaking through his seriousness. Yes, I rather think it will. I find, having considered the matter at some length these past 2 days, that I no longer care quite so much as I once would have. You could lose everything, Margaret said quietly, the words carrying a weight that suggested she was no longer entirely speaking of reputation alone. Your standing, your family's name, everything your father spent a lifetime, however imperfectly, protecting. I could, Nathaniel agreed. Or I could spend the rest of my life as a man who let the one person who ever showed him precisely what he was worth, flaws, and all face ruin alone, because defending her cost more than he was willing to pay. He paused, something raw and unguarded entering his voice for the first time since she had known him. I have spent a great many years, Margaret, being the sort of man who let other people bear the cost of his own carelessness. I find I am no longer willing to be that man, whatever it costs me. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, her composure, carefully maintained through every calculation and every careful negotiation of the past weeks, finally beginning to waver, not into tears precisely, but into something rather more vulnerable than either of them had yet permitted into the room. And if society does not forgive either of us for it, she asked very quietly. Then we shall be ruined together, Nathaniel said, which strikes me, on reflection, as considerably preferable to being respectable apart. Lady Caro's ballroom, on the evening in question, glittered with precisely the same brightness it had carried weeks before, the same crystal, the same candlelight, the same easy laughter of a society that had, by Friday, fully convinced itself of the worst version of the story circulating through its drawing rooms. Margaret arrived later than fashion dictated, dressed not in gray this time, but in a deep, quiet blue that Mr. Finch had gently suggested might serve her better than mourning, given the evening's particular demands, and felt, the moment she crossed the threshold, the full weight of every eye in the room turning toward her with the particular cruelty reserved for those society has already decided to condemn. She did not flinch. She had not flinched at 18, watching her mother's humiliation. She would not flinch now. Nathaniel found her within minutes, crossing the room with a directness that drew its own share of startled, whispering attention, and offered his arm with a formality that left no doubt, to anyone watching, of precisely where he intended his loyalties to be seen. Your Grace, Lady Caro herself said, approaching with the particular brightness of a hostess sensing scandal about to unfold beneath her own roof. I confess I had not expected to see Miss Ashworth among tonight's company, given the rather delicate nature of certain rumors currently circulating. "Then allow me to address those rumors directly, Lady Caro," Nathaniel said, raising his voice just enough to ensure the surrounding circle of guests, already turning, already listening, could hear every word. "Since I find I am rather tired of hearing my own affairs discussed in whispers by people who possess none of the relevant facts." The room's attention gathered toward him with the swift, hungry interest of an audience sensing a performance about to begin in earnest. "Miss Ashworth," Nathaniel continued, "is the sole owner of Ashworth and Sons, the firm that has held my family's debt for the better part of 3 years. I will not pretend that fact alone, given how thoroughly my own father indebted this estate before his death, does not reflect rather poorly on my own management of my affairs. It does. But I will say this plainly before every person in this room. Miss Ashworth has shown my estate more fairness, more patience, and considerably more competence than I had any right to expect, given that I greeted her, at this very ball some weeks past, with nothing but mockery for daring to understand the trade that has, in fact, kept my family's name from ruin." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, not quite scandal now, but something closer to startled fascination, the particular hush of an audience realizing the story they thought they knew was about to be rewritten in front of them. "I owe her an apology I have already given privately," Nathaniel said, "but I find I owe her something rather more public as well, an acknowledgement before all of you that the rumors currently circulating regarding the impropriety of our association are entirely without foundation, and that any further insinuation to the contrary will be answered, from this evening forward, as an insult to my own honor as much as hers." His gaze swept the room with a steadiness that dared anyone present to challenge him directly. "I am, in point of fact, considerably in Miss Ashworth's debt, financially, and in rather more ways than that. I do not intend to repay that debt with cowardice." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room recalculating, in real time, exactly how it ought to feel about a scandal that had just been declared, by the very Duke at its center, to be no scandal at all. It did not resolve instantly into approval. Society rarely surrendered its judgment so easily, and Margaret, standing beside him with her chin lifted and her composure holding by what felt like the thinnest of threads, could see, in the lingering coolness of certain faces, that some doors would remain closed regardless of what had just been declared. Lady Caro's own smile, when it came, was thin and uncertain. Several of the older matrons turned away entirely, their disapproval unmoved by a single duke's public declaration, however boldly given. For one long, suspended moment, Margaret believed entirely that the gamble had failed, that they had simply traded one form of ruin for another, that his public defense had cost him precisely as much standing as her reputation had already lost, and gained neither of them anything at all beyond the brief satisfaction of having spoken the truth aloud. And then, from the edge of the gathered crowd, an older gentleman she recognized, Lord Pemberton himself, the very man whose garden party had hosted the original cruelty 9 years before, stepped forward with the slow, deliberate gravity of a man whose opinion still carried considerable weight in rooms such as this one. "I knew your father, Miss Ashworth," he said, addressing her directly for the first time in the whole of the evening. "A shrewd man, honest in his dealings, whatever this room once thought of his manners. I confess I have not always conducted myself toward men of trade with the credit they deserved." His gaze moved, briefly, toward Nathaniel, something almost rueful in it. "It seems the Duke has found rather more sense on the matter than I managed at his age. I should be glad, Miss Ashworth, to have my own family's custom continue with your firm, if you would have it." It was not universal acceptance. It was not, by any measure, an instant unraveling of every whispered judgment the room had carried in with it that evening. But it was enough, a single, weighted voice of standing willing to extend its own credit to her reputation, and in a room that measured worth so precisely by whose approval one carried, It proved enough to turn the tide, slowly and unevenly, but unmistakably in their favor. By the time Margaret and Nathaniel left the ball that evening, later than either had intended, having spent the remainder of it answering rather more carefully phrased questions than outright accusations, the scandal had not vanished entirely. It would linger, in diminishing murmurs, for weeks yet. But it had ceased, crucially, to be a story about a woman's ruin, and had become, instead, a story about a duke's redemption, which society, Margaret reflected with a tired, disbelieving relief as Nathaniel handed her into her carriage, had always found rather easier to forgive. "You risked a great deal tonight," she said quietly, as he stood at the carriage door, seemingly reluctant to step back and let it close. "I find," Nathaniel said, "that I would risk it again without hesitation, given the same choice." He hesitated, something unguarded crossing his face in the lantern light. "I am not yet certain what I am asking of you, Margaret. I am not entirely certain I have earned the right to ask anything of you at all. But I find I do not wish this evening to be the end of whatever this has become between us." Margaret studied him for a long moment, the same long, level look she had once given him across a ballroom, weeks and a lifetime ago, though it carried, now, something considerably warmer than the cool assessment it had once held. "No," she said softly, "nor do I." Spring came early to Ravensford that year, or so the household staff insisted, though Margaret privately suspected the unusual mildness of the season had rather less to do with the weather, and rather more to do with the lightness that had settled over the estate since its mistress's arrival the previous autumn. She sat now in what had once been the late Duke's study, a room that had, for decades, held nothing but ledgers no one had properly examined and decisions no one had been brave enough to make, and found it transformed, gradually and deliberately, into something closer to the study she had left behind in London. Maritime charts on one wall, account books arranged with the precise, exacting order her father had taught her to keep, and a single new edition that would have astonished anyone who had witnessed the scene in this very county 9 years before. Nathaniel sat across from her, sleeves pushed back, a ledger open between them, his brow furrowed in the particular concentration of a man determined to understand something he had spent the whole of his life assuming was beneath his notice. "Explain to me again," he said, "why the insurance premium on the *Sparrow *S Autumn Crossing differs so significantly from the spring rate, when the route itself has not changed." "Because the Autumn Crossing carries considerably greater risk of storm," Margaret said, not glancing up from her own work, though the faint warmth in her voice suggested she found rather more pleasure in his asking than she would readily admit. "I have explained this to you 3 times now, Your Grace." "I am aware. I find I rather enjoy hearing you explain it." He set down his pen, watching her with the open, unguarded fondness that had, over the months since their marriage, become entirely unremarkable to the household staff, though it had once seemed entirely impossible to either of them. "Society," he added, "remains thoroughly scandalized that the Duchess of Ravensford spends her mornings reviewing shipping manifests rather than embroidery." "Society," Margaret said, "has remained scandalized by a great many things regarding our marriage, and yet somehow continues to extend us invitations." She glanced up at last, the faint, dry humor in her expression entirely her own. "I find I have stopped accounting for its opinion in my calculations." It had not been an easy transition, in truth, not the marriage itself, which had come more naturally and more swiftly than either of them, weeks before, would have believed possible, but the slower, more difficult work of building something genuine atop the wreckage of 9 years' resentment and 3 years' debt. There had been arguments, in the early months, sharp ones, born of old wounds neither had fully examined before binding their lives together. There had been moments when Margaret's old wariness resurfaced, certain still that some convenient performance was all his devotion had ever been. There had been moments when Nathaniel's pride, not yet entirely tempered, chafed against a wife who understood his own estate's finances rather better than he did, and said so without apology. But they had stayed through the arguments and the wariness and the pride, because each had discovered, slowly and somewhat to their own surprise, that the other was worth the staying. The firm continued under Margaret's hand, though Mr. Finch's name remained, by her own choice rather than necessity now, on its public documents, not out of fear of society's judgment, which had largely settled into a kind of grudging, profitable respect, but because she had found, in the years since her father's death, that she preferred her influence to remain quiet rather than loud. Power exercised without need for applause, her father had always said, was the only kind worth holding. The Ravensford estate itself, meanwhile, had been restored to a solvency it had not known in a generation, not merely through Margaret's capital, which she had been careful never to simply hand over, insisting instead on proper terms even within their own marriage, but through Nathaniel's own slow, genuine education in the management of his own affairs, conducted at her side rather than left, as his father's had been. To faceless men he never troubled himself to question. "I had a letter from Lord Pemberton this morning," Nathaniel said, returning his attention to the ledger before him. "He wishes to extend his firm's custom further, given the returns on last year's investment. He asked, rather pointedly, whether the Duchess might be persuaded to advise his own steward on a matter of tariff." "Tell him," Margaret said, "that the Duchess charges her usual rate, and that his steward will find the advice considerably more useful than his own assumptions have proven thus far." Nathaniel laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that had become, over the months, rather more familiar to this study than the careless, golden laughter he had once offered a roomful of strangers at her expense. "I shall tell him exactly that." He reached across the desk then, not for the ledger but for her hand, and signed his name to the document before them. A renewal, as it happened, of an old shipping contract, though this one bore both their signatures now, side by side, neither hand steadying the other so much as resting easily alongside it. He had signed his name to a stranger's ledger once, in another study, in another life, certain he had simply secured a faceless loan from a faceless house, never dreaming the woman behind it would come, in time, to hold rather more of him than his debt. He signed it now knowing precisely whose hand his own rested beside, and found, in the knowing, a satisfaction no fortune alone had ever given him. "Margaret," he said quietly, watching her review the final figures with the same careful, exacting attention she brought to everything she touched. "Yes. I find I am no longer the man who laughed at you for speaking of trade." She looked up at him then, something soft and unguarded passing between them. 9 years of old grievance, 3 years of careful debt, and one improbable, hard-won love, all settled at last into something neither resentment nor revenge had ever managed to touch. "No," she agreed, with the faint, warm smile she had once reserved only for ledgers that balanced precisely as they ought. "You are not. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories."